Napoleon's true failure was his arrogance. He believed Russia would fall quickly, that Moscow would be the end. But brilliant Russian strategy turned the tables. 1812 was a very special war. Come back to BattleGray. World history. The failure of Napoleon's campaign in Russia in 1812 has remained a haunting wound, not just for France, but for the entirety of Western Europe. This colossal military expedition marked not only the meteoric rise of Russia at the time, but also a historic shift in the balance between East and West. Napoleon, with his undefeated Grand Army, might have won. He could have even secured a decisive victory, had it not been for the merciless Russian winter. People often blame the sub-zero Siberian winds for what became one of the most humiliating military defeats in European history. Don't invade Russia in winter has become a cliché in Western military thought. But the Russians, they always knew. It wasn't just the cold. Snow and wind could never freeze the fiery patriotism in their hearts. French horses may have crushed Russian soil beneath their hooves, but no amount of firepower could silence the brilliance of Russia's military minds on September 15, 1812. Napoleon marched triumphantly into Moscow, but only 3 months later he was retreating, fleeing the capital of the resilient Russian people. Yes, Napoleon returned to France with his life that summer, but over 500,000 of his soldiers never made it out of Russia. The Russians did not merely get lucky, the winter was an asset. But the real victory belonged to the men and women who fought, resisted, and endured. Today, in this video, let's explore how the Russian people, with intelligence, resilience, and sacrifice, dismantled the most powerful expeditionary force the world had seen up to that point. Let's begin. First, we must admit, Russia's winter is terrifying. It is a brutal, unforgiving enemy, one not easily defeated. Geography has always played a profound role in the wars of Russia and later. The Soviet Union, before talking about the Western Front, take a look at the map of the world's largest nation. To the east lies Siberia, a natural fortress protected by temperatures dropping dozens of degrees below zero. Siberia is, in essence, a defense system of its own. No army could hope to invade Russia from the east unless they planned to fight. Snow itself, to the south, mountain ranges block invaders from Central Asia. To the north, frozen waters and Arctic winds create impossible conditions for assault. You could try to break through the ice, if you have the ship's strength and will to brave winds from the polar circle. No easier than facing the Siberian frost. But all these natural defenses make the vast eastern and southern regions of Russia nearly uninhabitable. That is why 70% of Russia's population has always concentrated in the narrow stretch of land in the west, right next to Europe. These natural realities shape the course of Russia's military history. North, east, and south are naturally protected. But in the west, Russia has nothing to hide behind. No mountains, no rivers, no natural walls. It's like leaving the front door open for your enemies. And history has proven this over and over again. Before the French came, it was the Poles, the Swedes, the Germans, all trying to invade Russia from the west. Western Europe's vast plains stretch from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, across northern Germany and Poland, into the Eastern European flatlands of Ukraine and the Baltic states. This massive stretch of open terrain, known as the European plain, is perfect for settlement, but it is also a welcome mat for invasion. For Napoleon's elite cavalry, riding into one of the flattest regions on earth was like swimming through water, their element. That is why he advanced so swiftly, not because the Russians were weak, but because geography offered them no natural defense from this direction. This is the polite way to say it, in truth. Russia had no natural gate to shut against the West. To resist Napoleon's cavalry head-on would have been suicide. Letting the French through was one thing. Defeating them, that was something entirely different. Russia's vast size, the depth of the east-west corridor, was the secret weapon that had Russia's borders matched modern-day Poland's. Napoleon's forces would still have needed to march over 1,000 kilometers just to reach Moscow. His army could blitz forward, but what about their supplies? Food, medicine. That wasn't a simple problem to solve. When Napoleon entered Moscow on September 15, 1812, the Russian leadership had already abandoned the city. But even then, from Moscow to Russia's eastern Pacific coastline was another 9,000 kilometers. Of course, no French soldier would march to the Pacific Ocean to fight a fishing village, but retreating just 0 to 3,000 kilometers east was already a massive challenge for any invader. And that's exactly what the Russians did. Moscow became a dead city, literally. It was scorched, abandoned, and unusable to either side. The French captured the capital, but not the victory. The Russians pulled back, stretching the east-west corridor even further, invading easy, winning completely. Impossible, the winter, the distance, the scorched earth policy. All of it conspired to grind Napoleon's forces down. The deeper they went, the more impossible it became to maintain supply lines. Russia didn't just defend itself, it waited for the perfect moment to counterattack and crush Napoleon's grand army under the weight of frost, fatigue, and fury. Yes, geography and winter helped, but they were only the starting point. The real dagger was Russia's spirit, its brilliant strategy and unbreakable will in war. It is not numbers, technology, or tactics that win. It is patriotism, the undying love of country. That love drove the Russian people to rise up and resist. It gave soldiers strength to fight through starvation and despair. The Russian spirit broke the invaders, not just the cold. The West often blames the Russian winter. But is it really possible Napoleon, one of history's greatest commanders, forgot about weather? Let's not forget, in 1805 at Austerlitz, Russia was defeated in freezing conditions far worse than those near Moscow. In Eylau, a brutal snowstorm didn't stop the battle from ending in a bloody stalemate. Napoleon knew how to fight in the cold. To suggest otherwise is an excuse, a cover for France's humiliation. At first, the French advanced, the Russians retreated. They had no strongholds to defend, so they kept falling back. But when Napoleon's army faltered and began to retreat, that's when the Russians struck, and the French just kept running. To outsiders, it looked like a reactive pursuit. But in truth, it was all part of a plan. Russia had been planning this trap since their defeats in 1805 to 1807, after the humiliating losses. Tsar Alexander I was forced to sign the Treaty of Tilsit with Napoleon, but both sides knew the peace was temporary. A short breath before the next storm. At that time, Russia was still part of a coalition with Austria and Prussia. But both those nations had already bowed to Napoleon. They couldn't help. Russia had to act asymmetrically, let the French have the land, then wait to destroy them. This idea became an official military plan in April 1812. Interestingly, it wasn't designed by a famous general, but by a little-known lieutenant colonel named Pyotr Chukovich. He worked inside Russia's Special Office of the Imperial War Ministry. The Special Office, a pet project of War Minister Barclay de Tolly, was essentially Russia's first official military intelligence unit. Chukovich wrote a powerful report titled Patriotic Ideas, outlining France's army structure and Napoleon's habits. His conclusion: Do not let Napoleon use his numbers. Avoid major battles, preserve your men, and let the invaders destroy themselves to execute their master plan. The Russians began retreating strategically, while launching a guerrilla war, especially behind enemy lines. They targeted French supply routes, weakening Napoleon's army over time and slowly tilting the balance in Russia's favor. It was a brilliant strategy. The French had only two ways to supply their troops: either transport provisions all the way from Western Europe, or resort to plundering local resources. But as the analyst foresaw, if the French chose resupply from the West, they'd be forced to haul supplies over thousands of kilometers on roads that were in horrendous condition at the time. All the Russians had to do was circle round, strike from behind, and disrupt the lines. The French would soon find themselves fighting on empty stomachs. The second option, looting, was no better, because the Russians had already implemented the scorched earth strategy. Wherever the French set foot, they found only death, no weapons, no food, not even winter coats. That's what Napoleon and his Grand Army walked into. A frozen wasteland of nothingness to make this supply line nightmare work. Guerrilla warfare was essential, and the Russians were masters of it. They developed many forms of highly effective guerrilla tactics. Even regular army units were split into small groups to harass the French from behind. These groups, led by officers, included Cossacks, light cavalry, and sometimes even light infantry. They carried light artillery for mobility and were tasked with reconnaissance, ambushes, and intercepting enemy messengers. This was guerrilla warfare in the information domain, but for exhausting the enemy's strength, irregular forces were also formed, made up of peasants defending their villages from foreign looters. Many of these local units were led by landlords or nobles familiar with basic military strategy. They recruited peasants who could wield weapons, hunters, woodsmen, anyone who lived off the land. Their communication was simple. Church bells, no. These peasant militias couldn't stand toe-to-toe with French soldiers, but they excelled at warning the trained Russian units whenever enemy movement was detected. If the villagers couldn't stop the invaders, the professional guerrillas would strike. Meanwhile, Russia's main army played a psychological role. They stayed just close enough to remain a threat, preventing Napoleon's army from relaxing or splitting up. The French were stuck, constantly on alert, never at ease, and this tension broke them. Many died of starvation before a bullet ever touched them. They didn't have enough troops to guard their own supply lines, yet Napoleon couldn't spare forces. He needed every man available to face the Russian army in case of a major battle. As the Russians retreated deeper into their own territory, the French advanced, but became increasingly isolated, stretching their supply chains across hundreds of kilometers. They had to leave thousands of soldiers behind to secure order in the rear, while the supply shipments from Western Europe began to dry up. The farther Napoleon pushed forward, the more vulnerable he became. His army was now riddled with deadly gaps, openings the Russians exploited mercilessly. Napoleon was marching straight into a trap. Even the abandonment of Moscow was part of this grand plan. Had the Russians stayed, they might have lost, but by retreating, they dramatically increased their odds of victory. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow, the city was already a lifeless shell. The French soldiers found food only in mousetraps. Napoleon lingered in Russia's largest city for several weeks, hoping to negotiate, but no agreement ever came. Those wasted weeks sealed the fate of the Grand Army. Eventually, the French began to retreat. At first, the weather was still manageable, but hunger hit hard. As temperatures dipped below freezing, horses began to die in droves. Some were slaughtered for meat. But without horses, the French had no cavalry, no carts, no mobility. That's when Russia's mobile units, especially the cavalry, launched relentless hit-and-run attacks. The French were now vulnerable prey. Every step they took was stalked. They lived in constant fear of ambush. Their supply wagons were looted. Morale shattered. What was once the world's most feared army was unraveling. It was no longer a battle. It was a slow execution. Russian winter winds didn't just freeze their skin. They froze Napoleon's dream of conquest. His men died of hunger before they died of frostbite, and when Russia finally launched its full-scale counterattack, it was less of a battle and more of a massacre. The Russians didn't even bother with close combat. They used artillery to rain fire on the French. The white snow turned red with blood. Napoleon had walked straight into a deadly trap. And the freezing weather was simply the final nail in the coffin. For Russia, 1812 was not just a military victory. It was a triumph of intellect, of discipline, of resilience in the face of brutality. The Russian people created a strategy and stuck to it. Their soldiers fought with courage, the land, the cold, and the plan all worked in harmony and together. They forged one of the most extraordinary victories in the history of humankind. History often remembers the victors, but rarely do we pause to understand why they triumphed. In the frozen fields of Russia, it wasn't just a military force that rose up against Napoleon. It was an entire nation, standing shoulder to shoulder, bound by duty, sacrifice, and an unbreakable love for their homeland. Russia didn't win because of chance. It didn't win because of snow. It won because it refused to surrender, because it fought not for conquest, but for survival, for freedom, for identity. Napoleon marched into Russia with one of the most powerful armies the world had ever seen. He expected submission. He expected glory. But what he found was a people who had mastered not just the art of war, but the art of patience, of strategy, and of unity under pressure. The year 1812 became a graveyard not only for 500,000 soldiers, but for the illusion of invincibility. For in the face of overwhelming force, it was not strength that won. It was endurance. It was will. It was the soul of a nation. And that is the real legacy of Russia's resistance. A lesson carved into the ice and blood of history, that even the mightiest empires can fall if they underestimate the power of a people who refuse to be conquered. Do not invade Russia in winter, they say. But the truth is deeper. Do not invade a land where the people are prepared to burn their own homes just to keep their freedom. Thank you everyone for watching the video. Remember to subscribe to the channel to receive more videos about Napoleon.